We've just heard two very practically oriented presentations from two individuals with a great deal of experience and expertise in patient involvement. In contrast to that, I'm someone who's very much an outsider to the practical side, and indeed I've been asked to take something more of a step back away from the practical and to think a little bit more abstractly and conceptually about what really is engagement and how might we think around that. As you see, my background is as a social scientist. So yeah, I'm somewhat removed, and as Peter mentioned at the beginning, there's some people here who are still trying to get their head around pharmacovigilance. I definitely include myself as one of those. But I have been working on a paper with Priya Bari, who you'll hear from later, and there we've been working on, as I'll come on to talk about, a conceptual framework, thinking around what engagement means in relation to pharmacovigilance. In the article, we go on to reflect on various methodological challenges of how we kind of capture engagement, how we can begin to measure it, and we come up with some solutions there. But I've been asked this morning to kind of stick to the more conceptual, and so I'll be doing that, but I'll also be bringing in a few insights from the wider social science literature on risk governance, because I think some of those insights can be valuable for our discussion this morning. That's what I'm going to be doing. I've been asked to address this slide, and I've left it in the original format just to make clear it's not my slide. I can't pretend to understand all that's going on in it, so please don't grill me about it later. I think it maybe is from Thomas Gudecker. I'm not sure exactly where it comes from, but anyway, the key things here in relation to engagement obviously are that it's very explicitly stated in the third pillar, but as many of you will know far better than me, it's also implicit yet absolutely fundamental to the achievement and the effectiveness of the first two pillars, in terms of the impact of risk minimization activities and the input and impact around pharmacovigilance processes. Engagement is absolutely vital to making and achieving those first two pillars. When we come to the fourth pillar, though, when we start thinking and reflecting a bit more analytically and methodologically, then various questions and issues arise, particularly when we start, as I say, thinking about what engagement is. And in the work that Priya and I have been doing together, in terms of broader reading, but also some more systematic looking at the literature, engagement, as many of you will be aware, has become increasingly commonly referred to, something of a buzzword, but yet it's very seldom defined, at least in the academic literature on drug safety and pharmacovigilance. It's often referred to seemingly as though everyone knows what it means, and then the authors move on. And the ambiguity there in the literature, often engagement and involvement are kind of used interchangeably, again, without much of an explanation, is something of a concern, particularly if we're interested in thinking in detail about measuring engagement and trying to kind of analyze and understand how it works. So just if I can just go back to that last slide, if you look at the pinky red arrows going around there, in the diagram, and we see thinking about measuring, evaluating, and optimizing. And I would argue that we can't really begin to clearly measure and evaluate and optimize unless we have a clear idea of what we're thinking about and what we mean when we're talking about engagement. So in our work, we've been trying to draw on a small number of very good studies in the field, both more conceptual and more empirical, which do start to say some very interesting things and present some very interesting findings around engagement. But we've also looked a little bit more broadly to the medical journals, but also to literatures which are closer to the kind of work I am usually involved with, which is work on the public understanding of science and around risk governance. And so Priya and I have been working in kind of trying to synthesize, bring all these different insights together, and that leads us to define engagement in the following way, as an ongoing process of knowledge exchange and knowledge adoption among stakeholders, and obviously in this case pharmacovigilance stakeholders. And in our work, in the article we've been working on, we go on to explain what knowledge adoption means in terms of development of mutual understandings, but also changes in behaviors or changes in policies following on from engagement. But then we go on to, as we've been thinking around what engagement means, we've gone on to elaborate the meaning of engagement along three dimensions. And that's what I'm going to be talking about just for the last 5 minutes or so of this talk. So we can think about engagement in terms of breadth. How many people are we seeking to engage? And when we think about outcomes, how many people are we actually, have we actually been able to engage? So that's the first dimension. The second dimension obviously relates to depth, because when we think about how many, we also need to think about what level of engagement are we achieving. And again, we can think about depth in terms of the design, what are we attempting to carry out? Do we just want to disseminate information? Do we want to go slightly deeper and enter more of a consultation type dialogue? Or do we want to go much deeper into a less structured but a deeper form of participation with various stakeholders? So we can think about that in terms of design. We can also think about depth in terms of the outcomes, the impact of different engagement initiatives. And we might think about that in terms of, depending on the initiative, in terms of increasing awareness. Is an engagement initiative actually shifting attitudes, or is it even changing behaviors? So we can think about different depths of engagement outcomes in that way, although again that will vary depending on the type of exercise we're involved with. And then, sorry, given the lighting in the room, I don't know if the bottom and the red, if that's that visible, but it relates to texture. It resonates very nicely with what Natalie was just telling us, particularly in terms of the feedback from different stakeholders. So the texture of engagement is the experience of engagement, how it feels to be engaged within a particular initiative. So that relates to the kind of interactive dynamics within an initiative. It relates to emotions and understandings of that initiative and how it works. And also, and again, as we heard very clearly in the feedback, it relates to issues of motivation and confidence and trust in terms of people's experiences there. And obviously that's a third but very crucial dimension to thinking around engagement and what it means for people practically. So that's just a quick sketch, and I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on each dimension, just saying a little bit more. So when we think about breadth, as I say, in some ways it's the simplest certainly to measure. It's a head count, how many people are involved. But of course, when we think about engagement, we can't just think about the number of people without also thinking about, what does engagement mean for that number of people, for those people, in terms of, has it just led to an increase in awareness amongst a particular initiative, or has it led to deeper changes in attitudes or even changes in behavior? So when as our three-dimensional metaphor tries to imply, whenever we're talking about breadth, depth is always there. We always need to think about them alongside one another. But when we're thinking about breadth in terms of a number of people, we also need to not just think about how many, but also who is involved, which groups are included, which groups are missing. And that might relate to different types of stakeholders or types of patients, but it also might relate to their social, economic, and cultural background. And I mention this in relation to some research I've been doing with some colleagues on an organisation I'm sure many of you will know in England called NICE. And NICE do different things, but one of their roles is also a form of medicines regulation, although it's about cost effectiveness regulation of some expensive new medicines. And similar to the EMA, NICE have tried to bring in patients because they know it improves their decision making, like we've been hearing about. It also improves the legitimacy of the decisions. But they've, as we found in our research with them, it leads to all sorts of questions about which patients are we actually able to bring in. And maybe these might be expert patients, but do they really represent the typical patient? If they're in some of our findings suggest largely white, middle class, highly educated, linked to certain patient organizations, then they have huge amounts of expertise and experience, but they might not necessarily be representing the typical patient. And in some engagement initiatives, that's not a problem, but maybe in other initiatives that can be an issue. So that's a kind of key concern that comes out in relation to breadth. depth. And I'm actually going to start on the middle point of those three. So as I mentioned, I just want to underline again, when we think about depth, we can think about depth in terms of how we design an intervention, in relation to what I mentioned earlier on about whether we're communicating or we want deeper levels of consultation or even participation. But we also need to think about outcomes. I've touched on that already. In the literature, there's a lot of suggestions that the deeper the engagement, the better, both in terms of the quality of knowledge. When stakeholders are more deeply engaged, there's more a greater level of exchange of knowledge, and therefore greater levels of expertise that are able to be drawn upon, and also greater levels of legitimacy for the process. But again, another key question that is existing in the wider literature is, if you're aiming for that deeper form of engagement, what are the implications of that for how you organize the types of initiatives that you're running here? Do you have to make things a little bit more open, a little bit looser, a little bit less tightly formulated, to give more space and to give real forms of input into certain types of decision making? The question from the floor to Maria earlier on about, do patients really get a say? I mean, that would be one such question there, and it's encouraging to hear that the answer was a positive one there. Then just finally, when we're thinking about texture, as I said, texture is about the experience of engagement. What does it feel like? Now, in some ways, texture isn't vital to understanding whether engagement works or not. Knowing how many people and how deeply impacted they are, the breadth and the depth is more crucial to understanding if it's worked or not. But in understanding how it's worked and why it's worked, then texture is everything. And again, it was great to hear the insights and the feedback that Natalie just shared with us, because that gives us a real feel of the kind of texture for some of these people. So although normally we might not think about texture as an outcome, it's maybe more of a process in terms of how engagement functions. When we take a slightly longer term view, then we can think about texture as an outcome, and indeed it has knock-on effects for the longer term. And again, we saw very nice glimpses of that in Natalie's talk. So to quote two Swedish researchers who've done work on trust and how that works around risk and risk communication, they say trust is created when citizens are emotionally involved, they take part, have a say, and in some sense are able to recognize themselves in the organization and the process of engagement. And we saw glimpses of that just in the previous talk, and we could imagine that those people feeding back positively will be more likely to be engaged and will find engagement easier in the future. So the texture of engagement at one point in time has knock-on effects for the future. I think I'm stretching my time already, so I'll just leave it on that concluding slide. But hopefully some of those conceptual ideas, particularly in terms of breadth, depth, and texture, might be useful for how we think about designing engagement initiatives, certainly how we might measure them, and also how we might understand what works and what doesn't. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. No, you stay here. As I said before, I think you're doing a very important job, because to some extent, sometimes I've had over the past years the sensation that, the patient community have been fighting for many years, I would say even for decades, for being engaged in certain areas, particularly in pharmacovigilance. And at a point, this door has opened, and as it happens in real life, when you are closed outside and you push on the door and suddenly the door opens, the first sensation is that you are in a new room, and you know what you want to do in that room, but at least you have to understand where you are and if it is indeed what you were expecting to. So I believe this exercise is essential also for better shaping our strategies from the patient point of view, but I believe also from the agency point of view. So if there is no burning question, I will start with one question that is, I want to state it very clearly, it's provocative, so okay. Don't take it wrong, but I'm very curious every time I hear the expression typical patient, because maybe the fact that I'm coming from a disease area in which it's very difficult to have the same kind of patient in the same court. So sometimes I wonder if the typical patient exists as a concept, and who assess who is the typical patient, or so how we can develop this concept.
Well, yeah, obviously you could think about what's typical or what's average in all sorts of different ways, and I mentioned just a few in terms of socioeconomic background or cultural background. Of course, again, that will vary widely when we're thinking across on a European level, because there's all sorts of different cultures and understandings of medicine which shape how people use medicines, which shape how people understand their medicine's use. I guess, yeah, one basic starting point would though be education level. Because when we're thinking about how people make sense of risk, how people understand risk, how accessible information is around risk in relation to products, then yeah, we can think about how education level may bear on the relative accessibility of that information. So in thinking about either not necessarily choosing one typical patient, but having trying to access patients from a broad range, say, of different educational levels, that would be one starting point in thinking about how we could achieve a slightly, possibly a more representative group, a more representative sample when we're thinking about engagement. But again, as I said, that will be very relevant and pertinent to some forms of activities, maybe less so for others. But that would be one starting point to answer your question.
Thank you. Is there any other question for Patrick or for the other two speakers? Any reflection?
Maybe just quickly, so thank you, Patrick, very much. I have to say, I think it's really important, the conceptual work, because it gives us an approach to how we might measure and how we might do better. And as you said in your introductory remarks, people often talk about it, but it's not well defined. And I see your work as starting a debate. And I hope it is the start of a debate, because I think in the area of pharmacovigilance and medicines regulation, these are relatively new discussions, and lots of people could and should contribute. In the spirit of debate, therefore, can I ask you about your definition? Because the more I think about it, the more it sounds right. But when you first put it up and it was about knowledge, it didn't seem intuitive to me. I mean, is engagement fundamentally about knowledge sharing and knowledge agreement? And I just wondered, is that well established in the social sciences literature, and you're applying it to pharmacovigilance, or is it a new way of looking at it that you're proposing? Thank you.
I guess, engagement could mean different things across many different contexts, but certainly in the literature around risk governance, then knowledge exchange is fairly central. But of course, it's important to recognise and think about knowledge in its broader sense. So that could be kind of scientific knowledge, but of course it could be lay experiences, again, as we've been hearing about in the first two talks. So it's knowledge in its broader sense. Although as the texture part gets at, engagement is not just about the kind of cognitive cerebral knowledge side. It's also about how people feel and around risk. But knowledge and communication flows would be fairly central, at least as it's related to the risk governance literature.
I thank you, Patrick, again. I think it's very refreshing. And actually, I think when you were presenting, after looking at all the work you have done, what is really encouraging in a way is to see how, from a conceptual point of view, more or less there are a lot of, not overlaps, but we arrive sometimes to the same conclusions, in the sense that what we have learned a lot while implementing the legislation in pharmacovigilance in particular is that there is not a single way to engage the public and the patients, and that at the end of the day, depending on the circumstance, depending on the issue at stake, we have to develop different models, different methods, which actually in a way reflects the different levels that you come up with. So in a way, it's very good to see that from different angles, from a more practical point of view to a more conceptual one, we arrive to the same conclusion. So for us, the challenge sometimes is how to choose the best way, how to choose the best model, which will maybe get the results we want in a more efficient way, and maybe in terms of also supporting the patient participation, etc., and then getting the expected results. Looking at your work, have you looked at different models that you have maybe, and do you see very different approaches to the? Have you looked at models only in medicines regulation, or have you looked beyond that in terms of engaging the public?
Yeah, in terms of my awareness of the broader literature, for example, around risk governance, then yeah, there is a very broad literature indeed relating to all sorts of particularly forms of technology, particularly novel technologies. Yes, some of the work I've drawn on, there's a number of researchers working at Cardiff. That's always been happened to be a university where there's lots of people working around public understandings of science and risk governance. And so there's people there who've done work on all sorts of new technologies, nuclear power being one particular one, understandings of and fears around pandemics being another. Food being another. So yeah, there's many different literatures that could be drawn on to inform kind of what the EMA and broader initiatives do. And obviously, of course, there are some very specific aspects which are very particular to the type of regulation that you're involved with. But in terms of the social dynamics and the lessons to be learnt, I would argue that there's a lot that's very transferable in terms of knowledge and understandings and good practice. Does that answer it?
So yes, please.
Hi, Sue Rees representing FBIA. I think you said that engagement helps to build trust. And I was just wondering whether it's one thing the patients engaging with the regulators, but obviously within industry, we're also very keen to understand the patient's voice. And I think most pharmaceutical companies sat around the table will have individuals involved in patient engagement, patient centricity. I'm just wondering whether you feel that there is a barrier to a certain extent of patients engaging with things like industry because of trust or lack of trust.
I don't know of any empirical studies, so I wouldn't. Yeah, I don't feel comfortable saying too much of that. Certainly. I'm just trying to. I mean, certainly some qualitative studies I'm aware of. Where patients have been referred to, or patients have been interviewed. Then, that points towards awareness of industry. Although I would imagine also for other patients, and again depending on who they are and their background, people consume medicines or use medicines implicitly, I guess, or in a taken for granted way that the manufacturer is somewhere in the background, but that's not really in their consciousness, not in their what we call their life world of how they think about and trust in and use their medicines. In those contexts, generally the prescriber and possibly the pharmacist but also other people around them will be much more central to how they think and understand their medicine. So there's definitely research that suggests that trust is an issue, but there's also a question about who is on people's radar when they think about medicines, and in some high-profile cases, I guess the manufacturer may be, but in other situations, maybe the manufacturer isn't seemingly so explicitly relevant to how they think about that.